So this week's lecture is all about addressing diversity in our math instruction. So what strategies can we use in our toolkit to support diverse learners by addressing differences in ability, language, and background within our mathematics classrooms specifically? So when we think about diversity in math classrooms, diversity can encompass a lot of different things. Students are on various ends of the spectrum with their ability to understand language, their ability to understand symbols, their ability to visualize and have spatial reasoning, and all of these different spectrums of understanding of these concepts can impact and create differences in the ability a student has to learn and require some additional instructional techniques to help them be successful in the course. And we may need to specifically address language proficiency, cultural and socioeconomic backgrounds, and even just prior knowledge that might be missing. So our classrooms are very diverse, and there's an entire ecosystem of things happening where every individual student could be in a different place or have a different ability that they need to strengthen. And so as you consider this, think about each individual learner in the classroom and try not to become overwhelmed by that process, but just keeping them in mind as we walk through this presentation may give you some ways to address things. And so there are two main learning disabilities in math instruction that we're going to talk about in this chapter based on our textbook. So there are a lot of other learning challenges, but for this week, we're specifically looking at dyscalculia and ADHD. And dyscalculia affects our number sense, and it makes it difficult to understand the basic mathematical concepts that involve patterns and operations. And it can cause miscalculations within just crunching numbers. It can even translate into solving equations, finding the slope of graphs, and it can fundamentally unravel some of the key algebraic concepts that are happening in a secondary classroom. So being aware of this, looking at, is there an issue with number sense, operations, finding a pattern in something, that could be indicative that a student is struggling with dyscalculia. With ADHD, this is going to affect their attention and their executive functioning, and it leads to difficulties in following multi-step problems, sustaining focus, and really managing frustration. And as the parent of a kid on the autism spectrum, she very specifically has challenges related to executive functioning. And if you think about yourself, and you try to put yourself in the role of someone with executive functioning challenges, imagine yourself in Books-A-Million, and you have to pick a book, and there are literally millions of choices. In the math classroom, there are multiple ways to solve a problem in most cases, and just even having 5 things to pick from feels like being in that bookstore with a million books to choose from, and it's overwhelming, and so they become very frustrated. It's also in the attention to detail with an ADHD as well. It could be miscopying something from one line of work to the next, so their thought process may be 100% correct, but they didn't copy down a negative sign. And so being really aware of the different challenges with these two learning disabilities is going to be very key to help you be able to support the learners in your classroom and accommodate them in the best ways possible. So some of the challenge they face is fast-paced lessons. We know there's the push to make it through your book, teach end to end, and there's not a lot of time for learners who are struggling with executive functioning or who are struggling with number sense and patterns to really master a concept. And so what can happen is when we're moving too quickly, it can lead to a lot of frustration and ultimately to a lack of motivation and disengagement from the class. One of the things that you can really do is be a voice of encouragement here. See them when they're frustrated. Address that frustration. Immediately go to their desk and see if you can help them work through something. And just overcoming that little piece of the puzzle is going to feel like a major relief for that student. Students with these disabilities also rely on memorization. If you're struggling with number operations and number sense, the easiest workaround as a young person, or at least the option that feels the easiest, might just be to memorize everything. But that then causes issues because when we get to equations and other concepts, you can't go on a memorized basis. You have to understand the operations that are happening. And so recognizing those early signs that a student is only relying on memorization is really important, and to kind of help them draw parallels and help them grasp those concepts is going to get in front of things that are going to happen later on. Another issue is there could be a lack of step-by-step guidance, and this is often the thing that I say the most about a textbook. A textbook is a starting point for a teacher. A textbook is not going to break everything down into a step-by-step guidance. It's not going to address common misconceptions, and it's not even really going to scaffold them up. Like the first example is so easy in a lesson, and then that last example is so hard, and there's not a lot in the middle that gets them to the point where they can do it. So really being aware that there is some minimal scaffolding that might need to be addressed can be an excellent strategy to support these students. And really, without support addressing these challenges, students are going to become frustrated, they're going to disengage, they're going to become overwhelmed, they're going to hate math for life. And so really just being on the lookout and adding in a couple of examples to your lesson plan to really help bridge that easy to that hard. Watching them to see if they're memorizing and trying to instead work with them through the concept. And slowing down lessons where we can. Now, you are juggling a lot of things as a teacher, and you can't be everything to everyone, and you're not every day going to address all of these challenges. But just keeping them in your toolkit and doing a little bit with it is going to have a high return on investment and really show your students that you care about them. So what are some strategies to support students? Multisensory techniques, so using manipulatives and visual aids help people identify patterns, especially visual aids. These can really help our students that have dyscalculia. They can really keep a ADHD student engaged and give the additional stimulation that their brain needs in order to be able to focus. And providing some extra time and step-by-step guidance to break down complex math problems can be really helpful. And it doesn't always have to be one-on-one. This could be in peer groups. This could be providing resources within the home for the parents to supplement with whenever possible. It could also be pulling a student to the side while the rest of the class is doing their work. So finding creative ways to give that extra time and that additional guidance can be really key. And then also hands-on learning. As much as we can get students moving and interacting, that's going to be even higher engagement and active learning. And sometimes that feels like it's relegated only to the elementary classroom, but even in secondary education, getting them moving is so important because those kinesthetic learners, who typically are the ones that are most impacted by ADHD and dyscalculia, getting them up and moving is going to make more important synapses in that brain for them to be able to connect the concept to the movement and then recall it when they're being assessed. When we talk about language proficiency, we have English language learners in our math classroom, and that can be particularly challenging because they're going to be unfamiliar with the vocabulary and word problems. Our everyday English vocabulary is vastly different from the vocabulary of an academic subject. And so just being aware that they might struggle with some of the word problems due to unfamiliar vocabulary or things that aren't going to kind of translate well or don't have an equivalency in other languages can really get in front of things. Even if you're just reading over the word problems and explaining them to the class a little bit more, spending a couple of minutes on a particularly challenging vocabulary word could be really helpful. In addition, images, they always help. Giving some visual representations for abstract concepts can be good. As much as we can show, if we're showing an equation, can we show the symbols of the equation? Can we show the actual items? Can we show the word problem in picture form and have them label it? So as much as you can develop those types of resources, it's really helpful. And just know that may not all happen your first year. Maybe it's that you say, okay, one lesson plan a week. I'm going to take the word problems and make some sketches. And so one day a week, I've got sketches that go with my word problems. So managing these strategies with what is doable is another key piece for you as a classroom teacher to think about. There can also be limited opportunities for discussion-based learning. Reading for English language learners is even more challenging than talking, and so traditional math instruction is very written, and that can be very difficult, whereas if you're asking them to explain verbally, to give you their reasoning, you're really able to better interpret what they're trying to do, and they're also going to understand it better. So if we're thinking of specific strategies, visual supports like diagrams, charts, drawing, having them label the word problem. Provide sentence stems that structure the discussion and help them articulate their thinking. So highlight the key vocabulary in the lesson. That's really important. Just by having everyone use consistent wording and language in those things, that can be a help for all students, not even just our ELL learners. Having them work collaboratively to problem solve. Encouraging them to work in groups, sharing strategies is going to help not only those ELL students, but also your students with learning differences, and also even just your average students that may not necessarily have these same challenges, but are going to benefit from hearing things explained different ways from their peers. Another common tactic is to use glossaries, word banks, or parallel language resources to support your learners. And so having a glossary available on a test for them to reference back can be really helpful. Again, can you have a glossary done today for every single lesson? Probably not, but can you start with one a week? Possibly. And are there already glossaries for your curriculum out there? It's very likely that there are. So finding some of these resources in today's technological world doesn't necessarily mean that you're completely on your own. There are probably other resources created by teachers that can be supportive. Socioeconomic and cultural diversity is a severely impactful area within a math classroom because so much of what we do in today's world is becoming technology reliant. And so we're utilizing Google Classroom, we're utilizing take-home resources and videos and AI tutors and all these other things that all require having technology in your home, having access to Wi-Fi, and not having these things can really be a barrier to students from a lower socioeconomic status. Assuming that prior knowledge exists with the class is always kind of a tricky thing because you never know if they have that prior knowledge. And in our traditional math curriculums, it is built very much foundational layer upon layer upon layer. And so we do make a lot of assumptions about foundational knowledge. And so just taking a beat and during a unit and saying, what things did I think students had coming in here that they didn't have? And then reflecting and making a meaningful practice of writing those things down so the next year when you have your students, you might be able to get in front of some of those assumptions that were made that maybe weren't as accurate. There can also be a limited cultural relevance in math problems. Math problems often do not reflect the student body that you instruct. And so adapting it whenever possible is a great strategy, even if it's just I have 10 kids on the basketball team in my classroom, so today's word problem is going to be about basketball. I have 6 students that are celebrating this particular event. I'm going to make it about this event. So bringing things into the classroom that they can relate to on a cultural level is also going to be key, and it's really going to create that inclusive and engaging environment that makes students want to do the math. And so some other pieces are there's a lot of research out there right now on culturally responsive teaching. If you type this into the library, you're going to find so many great resource articles on how to do this. And really it comes down to incorporating real world math problems that have examples of diverse cultural backgrounds or lived experiences for students. That could be a geographic culture. It's something that the city of New Orleans has lived through, so it's something that we can pull together for the class. It could be that you have different ethnicities in your class and you want to pull from their ethnicity and their cultural background there. It could be lots of different things. So just even the smallest interjections of culture into your lessons with different diverse names and things like that can really help students to engage. Access to online resources is key. Find out if your district or your school has a free Wi-Fi program. Find out if there are resources they can check out to bring technology into their homes. And then really looking at collaborative learning. Students learn when they learn from one another, not just mathematical concepts, but about shared life experiences. And they're going to make meaningful connections that as they're doing their math work, they can pull back from and be able to reference to remember key ideas that you taught in the class. And many times, gifted students, the topic of this comes up, and not everyone realizes that gifted students do need additional support as well. They may not be challenged with it, which then kind of puts them at a stagnant growth place where they're not really engaging in the class. They're not really looking at more complex ideas, so they become complacent and they sit back, and then over time that student goes from being ahead of the class to being behind the class because of that. They also may need some extra support with the pace. Learners who need additional support in math may become overwhelmed or discouraged, again, as they're kind of falling behind from just doing the bare minimum. Someone who's at the very front of the class at the end of the school year could very much wind up at the back of the class because of that. And whole class instruction really does not account for different learning speeds. Thinking about how can I structure my lectures or my teaching time so that I'm not teaching the entire period. Can you teach a portion of the period, then utilize group work or utilize other components of work in order to be able to give some peer time and to give one-on-one support as peers are supporting in those groups. You can also offer tiered assignments. Look at a range of assignments with different levels of complexity. A lot of curriculums are nowadays coming like pre-prepared with these differentiated levels, so you are able to kind of pull something out of your teacher toolkit without having to reinvent the wheel. Also, using a flexible grouping strategy with different abilities within the group can also help that student who might be doing better engage more and explain to someone else, which means that they're not sitting back and doing just the bare minimum. It also means the students who are struggling are getting it explained in a different way that's really helpful for them. Keeping the curiosity going with extension activities can also be a great way to manage the behaviors in your classroom and keep those kids engaged. So what extensions can you give that might allow an advanced learner to explore something independently that's going to reinforce what you are teaching, but also keep them engaged and keep them interested in the lessons in the classroom? Too many of our standard instructional methods are rigid. So in the math classroom, traditionally we have relied on direct instruction. We've not really used interactive elements, or we try to use interactive elements, but maybe they only come out once a month or even less frequently. We also expect all students to kind of master everything at the same pace, and that's just not true, especially when it comes to reasoning or to any kind of spatial understanding of concepts. And if we only use traditional timed assessments, then our reliance on that is going to bring us a group of students who can only recall and regurgitate information to us and cannot think critically or make meaningful conclusions, which is definitely what we are looking to teach. So be sure to use those flexible teaching approaches. Use hands-on activities with manipulatives. Do an experiment. Ask them what they find. Ask them to find the pattern. Do a simulation. Encourage group work. Use problem-based learning. Present them with a real-world problem and ask them to solve it. Ask them to build a bridge that can hold a certain amount of weight so that you can create a prototype. Create flexible assessments that include projects or oral explanations, open-ended questions that allow students to show you their understanding of concepts in different ways. And then just allow multiple ways for learners to demonstrate understanding. Their understanding doesn't always have to be demonstrated in a multiple choice or open response test. They can demonstrate it visually, they can demonstrate it orally, they can demonstrate it in many different ways, and being flexible with that is going to be really key. Another piece to really just be aware of is, again, those textbooks do not come with step-by-step guidance. They are definitely skipping over steps that learners are particularly going to get stuck on. And so realizing that as you're lesson planning and adding in a couple of examples that bridge that gap or adding in some notes on how to explain getting from one step to the other is going to be key in success in your classroom and serving diverse learners. Also, insufficient modeling and guided practice. Too often in algebra, it's equation, 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 and then we want them to interpret a graph, but we haven't actually made those connections. Make sure that you are modeling what is happening. If you're giving them an equation, can they visualize what that equation looks like and how it is modeling something in the real world? Can you give them guided practice before they start independent work? So instead of just you teaching the concept, work the concept with the student and then be able to do it. So I like to call this I do, we do, you do. So I'm going to demonstrate it. We're going to do it together, and then you're going to be able to work on it independently. And I've scaffolded you into a successful place. Some additional strategies are chunking information. So take those big, large problems and break them into smaller parts that make sense to give that step-by-step explanation. Modeling how to solve the problem and narrating that process verbally is incredibly important to students as you're working through that problem. Say exactly what you're thinking so that you're giving that clear narration. Providing sentence frames can really help students articulate their thought process when it comes to problem solving by offering some structured language templates to organize that explanation, which is again going to be really, really critical with those English language learners. And so in this session, we've talked about all of these different strategies, and I just want to reinforce that we've talked about these strategies, but it's not that you're going to have the time, the ability to do all of them in 1 year or even in one lesson. Take something that is manageable. Set a manageable goal, like every lesson has a template on Monday. Work with that through. As you get that done, if you have time, maybe everything on Wednesday gets a picture representation for the word problems. Find manageable ways, because you're going to be in your classroom for a while, and the more that you can share resources with other teachers and build the resources that you have, the better that instructional strategy is going to get. So just take it one moment at a time.